Joining me now from London to discuss women's status in China is Keyu Jin, Assistant Professor of Economics from the London School of Economics. Thanks so much for joining us. You're in the unique position where having lived in the West, but also from China. Can you describe for us the differences between women's rights in China and, say, in London where you are now?
I think a remarkable characteristics of the Chinese society, especially until now, has been that gender equality has been very good, and I think a lot of that can be attributed, interestingly enough, to the one-child policy. What we have found in research is that the one-child policy, because the family has only one child, regardless of gender, will invest heavily in the education of that one child. And so the gender gap in terms of education investment received by girls have significantly closed from in the past when you had families with one or two or three more children. And that is manifested by the returns to education, which has been actually found to be higher now for girls than for boys in China. So after starting from the 1990s, you see that the college education attainment rate, that gender gap has significantly closed. So the one-child policy has been a special, has this unintentional consequence of actually giving girls a greater status in society.
That's so interesting you say that, because that's such a counter-narrative to what we normally hear in the West, that it's sort of restrictive, if you like, of women's role. How did you find that personally growing up?
Well, personally, that's exactly, you're looking at a only child of the post-80s generation, where in school we felt absolutely no difference in terms of gender and for anything, basically. And it's funny because the first time I've actually heard about gender issues was when I came to the West to study. In the past, in China, it's just never been something that people discuss. Girls were as equally hardworking, if not more so, than boys. And actually, progressing onto middle school, high school, and college, girls still do fairly well. So when I was in China, I didn't even know that there was such an issue, but of course I was younger back then.
Yeah, and of course behind the scenes there are still issues. Wage differences, for example, that mirror here in the United States and in the UK, where women still earn significantly less than their male counterparts for similar jobs.
Oh, I think that is true if you look at the data, but the interesting thing is to look at wage differentials conditional on education and differences. So my generation, which is really just about to enter or become the main agents of the economic arena in China, we are the first generation who have received as much education as boys. And so it will be interesting to see in the next few years whether that wage gap, at least conditional on education, could close. But an interesting point is that now we have just recently launched the two-children policy. Now that's going to be bad for women, and I'll tell you exactly why.
Yeah, please do. Why?
Now, companies that hire women now are much more reluctant to do so because, of course, maternity leave constitutes a major challenge for companies in general.
And that's, sorry to interrupt,
in the past, when you had the only...
That's maternity leave is guaranteed in China, correct? So companies have to factor this in.
It is guaranteed. However, in the past, women can only have one child. So after that child, it's pretty much done. Now, companies are very reluctant to hire women, giving the reason that even if you had one child now, you're likely going to have another one in a few years' time. So this policy has actually led to a disadvantage for women in the labor force, and I hear about that all the time around the country.
Now, I was going over the research here and noticed that there's quite a high proportion of women at managerial levels in Chinese companies. But given what you've just said about how there's now a feeling of not hiring women because of the new two-child policy, how much is women's presence in the boardroom and at other managerial levels in China window dressing, and how much is it real?
Oh, no, I think it is very much real. I mean, first of all, we haven't really introduced the notion that there has to be quotas for women's on boards. Like I was saying before, this notion of gender issues as we institutionalize it or intellectualize it is not quite in the Chinese society yet, because I think part of the communist legacy, the good part about it, was that women had played an active role in all parts of society compared to many other societies. So it hasn't really become a political, social issue. So what you're seeing are very, very capable Chinese women who play key roles, especially in businesses and also a bit in government. So I don't think it's, I think it's very much real. But also for my generation, because we're only in our, the first generation, the only child are in their early 30s, it will take a few years before they step on these key positions. And you're likely going to see an altogether even more improved situation because, again, we're the first generation to have received as much education as boys.
I'd like to just widen it out a little bit, because just how far have women's rights and women's place in the workplace changed over the last 50, 60 years? I remember when I first went to China learning about the ancient practice of foot binding and all these things that happened even into the first half of the 20th century. And now you look at people like yourself sitting there, obviously a woman of the world and a major academic record behind and in front of you. How far have Chinese women come?
Well, I think there has been the biggest change occurred after basically the founding of our country in 1949. And so before, you're very much right in the sense that women played a special role as a family member, as those who took care of the family. And this goes back to very traditional roles that even generations, my grandmother's generation, assumed. So we've come a long way since the 1950s and 1960s, but I think the evolution, because the Chinese society is also evolving over time very rapidly, it is really hard to not say that there's a new phenomenon every 10 years or so. So while what I had said was true about the first generation of only child receiving high education, also receiving very, which, the high education translated into very high education attainment, society is still evolving even today. And so I think the social forces are such that now we're kind of going towards a little bit of a Japan-Korea phenomenon where the social pressure for girls to get married still at an early age and to assume that kind of image of a good mother and wife is still very much present, and I find that very puzzling.
Yeah, because of course you can't do absolutely everything. No one can do that in life. And then also there is this rule in China where women retire earlier than men as well, correct? So if you bring in a second child, maternity leave and 5 years earlier retirement for women, it starts to look like the deck is kind of stacked against women in terms of their career path.
Oh, absolutely. So women have, in general, 5 years, at least for state-owned enterprises, they retire at 55, which is a very young age. But I suppose that what I was really getting at is that while the economic forces plus the unintentional consequences of one-child policy have really given Chinese women a golden age, and I really do believe that. How society is evolving today is also interesting. It's that traditional notion of women still need to, assume that family position despite her education because her parents tell her that the most important thing for a woman is still to get married and bear children. There's a very interesting clash between the tiger mothers that educate the girls and ask them to be number one and push them to be number one all the way until they graduate from college, and then don't worry about your career, just get married. So that kind of, I see that grave contradiction, and it's very much shaping the mentality of the only girls, because they feel this extra duty to their parents precisely because they're only children. So I do see that bit of a tension and contradiction and dilemma in today's society.
Tradition and modernity pulling in different directions. Thank you so much.